This is the Investor Connect podcast program. I'm Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of this show in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, family offices, private equity, and many other investors for early stage and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Shawn Singh, Chief Executive Officer and Director at VistaGen Therapeutics. Shawn, thank you for joining us.
Oh, Hall, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on today with your listeners.
Great. Can you tell us a bit about your background? What did you do before you took on this role?
Oh, a lot of different pathways. I initially started as a corporate finance lawyer, believe it or not, way back 30 years ago now, for a large firm in Silicon Valley, Morrison & Foerster. Worked on a lot of IPOs for high tech and biotech, and figured out very early that I had a passion for the biotech side, especially as I would write prospectus after prospectus for emerging biotech companies. I ended up going in-house with the company that I had taken public, Cyclone Pharmaceuticals. Was there for about 8 years. And then after solidifying them with capital, with good following from UBS on the street, moved over to the buy side and formed a group called Cato BioVentures, a venture capital firm focused on life sciences that was affiliated with a contract research organization, Cato Research, that it's the kind of company that helps you get through all the hoops and hurdles in our business with the FDA. And ran that for 8 years. And VistaGen was a portfolio company of the successful venture firm. And my arrangement always was, when I saw something that had game-changing potential, I could make the move in-house, and that landed me at VistaGen. First, I was a director for a while and then took over as CEO later on.
Well, great. So tell me about your domain and the work you do in it there.
VistaGen is squarely focused on what we call the central nervous system, or CNS arena. That's a segment of the biopharmaceutical market. We are a publicly traded company, as you know, on NASDAQ with our tickers VTGN. And we and our peers are focused on medications that are addressing both neuropsychiatric and neurological disorders. So neuropsychiatric meaning depression, anxiety, suicidality, and neurologic meaning pain, dyskinesia, or movement disorders, epilepsy. So anything that is associated with impacting the central nervous system is in our scope. Our primary focus within that segment is on neuropsychiatric indications.
Great. And so what's the primary trend in this segment? What's going on there with it that you want to share with us?
Well, you see it in the news every single day. We Americans, not just we Americans, but globally, we worry a lot. We worry about our health, our safety, now our finances, our loved ones, social unrest, electioneering, all kinds of reasons why we've got in this country, even before COVID and even before social unrests, 40 million adults wrestling with anxiety disorders. So huge segment of the population affected by these indications. We've got another 17, 18 million, even before COVID, wrestling with depression. We're seeing skyrocketing rates of suicidality. So these are troubling days. And what's unfortunately the case, it's clear current standard of care, at least from the medication perspective, is falling far short of what people need to wrestle through their anxiety or their depression, or to hammer down their suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So we're trying as an industry, and we certainly as a company, we've got to go beyond the current standard of care. And I think that's the most exciting aspect of what people are doing, is we're trying to find drugs and develop them. And many of them have been found and are in development, including we've got 3 in development, 2 of them in late stage development, that work fundamentally differently. The way that they work in the brain is completely different from the drugs that are household names to a lot of people, antidepressants like Prozac and Zoloft, Paxil, anti-anxiety drugs, benzodiazepines like Xanax and Valium and Ativan. These drugs have been around for decades, and the way they work challenges they present, the safety concerns associated with them, they're all crystal clear. And we also know how they work, how effective they are, and how ineffective they might be for millions of people suffering with these disease states. So the challenge on the industry now is to find new generation medications that work better, that work faster in particular, and that don't carry with them a tremendous risk of addiction, of sedation, of hallucinations, dissociation, issues that are more challenging in some cases than the underlying condition they're trying to arrest.
And how do you see the COVID pandemic progressing solutions in this area? I'm sure it's raising awareness, but beyond that, how do you see COVID actually helping get to better solutions?
Well, in some ways it's helping. In some ways, I'm not so sure it's helping. In the way that it's helping, which I'm extremely happy about. We've been on this quest for many years. You don't just sneak up into the position we're in just on the other side of a pandemic. We've been focusing on trying to find these solutions for quite a while and have made tremendous progress. I think the challenges along the way for the patient quite often have been historically the stigma attached to mental illness. And I think that is now, it's at least one of the silver linings of the COVID pandemic, is it's becoming a lot more normative to address mental illness, to seek help for mental illness, depression, anxiety in ways that just really haven't ever been the case. In years past, other diseases have been in sort of this taboo mode and stigmatized and hush-hushed, and people reluctant to discuss them. Breast cancer, prostate cancer, even not that long ago. Now that comes up and the response is, okay, not great, but here's what you do, A, B, C, D, E, to try to arrest the problem and tackle it. That needs to become the case with mental illness. And it is, fortunately, because the problem is at pandemic levels on the mental illness side, it's not unusual for someone to have a reason to need help. And those are in the press every single day. I think one of the downside is, there's a class of drugs in particular for anxiety, the benzodiazepines. These are drugs like Valium and Klonopin and Xanax and Ativan. And it was becoming clear pre-COVID that these are addiction issues and overdose issues, and really a use of benzodiazepines at an epidemic level that was alarming. And that had arrested the use a little bit of these types of drugs. But the COVID pandemic has kind of flipped the switch on that again. And we're seeing, for example, last quarter, we saw data showing about a 34% increase in prescriptions for benzodiazepines. So that's despite their extremely well-known and established side effects and safety concerns, the cognitive impairment, risk of addiction, tolerance that you build up, memory issues, the potential to, when combined with opioids, we're finding 30+% of opioid deaths, unfortunately, also show that benzodiazepines have been on board. So that part hopefully will be reversed. I think we need to raise awareness about safety issues related to these kinds of drugs in ways that patients don't typically always know from their doctor. It's much like the case early on with opioids. I mean, when they're used for short-term relief of anxiety and panic, then there's definitely a place. But they all work to really slow down the nervous system, and they induce a state of mental and physical relaxation. They work really fast, but their issues also arise pretty quickly. So have to be careful.
Well, do you see new therapeutics coming up that may solve that issue but bring a better solution?
Well, there's never a one-size-fits-all solution for any of these mental health illnesses. And I want to just emphasize the first stop is always talk therapy, psychotherapy, seeing a skilled mental health professional. All the medications historically and in the future, they're really just to complement that kind of cognitive-based therapy or just discussion therapy with a mental health professional. it takes time to work through these, and hopefully the medication can provide assistance. What we need are drugs that work, for example, in anxiety as fast as benzodiazepines or faster. Our lead drug does that. It's a drug called PH94B. It's a neuroactive nasal spray, a remarkably unique mechanism of action that works completely differently than every drug ever approved for anxiety. And that's entering into phase 3 development, which is the final phase of clinical development required by regulatory authorities before you can submit an application for approval. And so we need drugs that work quickly like benzodiazepines, but without really the baggage that is associated with them, the sedation, the cognitive impairment, the memory issues, the cloudiness, the fuzziness. There's other issues too that you just have to be careful with. So that's what's emerging, at least in the anxiety arena. There unfortunately isn't much else, and we have quite a bit of white space around us at this point in terms of anything that's in late stage development for our lead indication, social anxiety disorder. And that's an indication even before COVID. It affected about 20 million Americans. And this is a case where even before COVID, with rising pressures from social media here in Silicon Valley, increased team orientation in the workplace, any situation where social or performance oriented, where there's anxiety up front of a particular event. So if you have to give a speech or a presentation to your colleagues at Google, even if you have to go on a date or eat alone in a food court, have an interview for a job or a meeting with your boss, many of these anxiety-provoking triggers for a social anxiety disorder patient cause them to have profound fear of being judged or embarrassed or humiliated. And it really is a debilitating situation where they just choose to often not embrace the situation. So in many cases, that could involve opportunity costs. You don't get the relationships that you want, the job you want, you don't get the promotion you want. And there's really nothing that can help you on an acute basis, right? So what's needed is what isn't available. What is needed is something that you can take out of your purse or your backpack or your briefcase, and in the window of time up front of a particularly anxiety-provoking stressor or situation, you can use it almost like people would use a rescue inhaler for asthma attack they anticipate coming, or a migraine drug up front of a migraine episode. We need something in the anxiety arena that can accomplish that calming effect, that anti-anxiety effect, but without putting you to sleep or without causing you to potentially become addicted or develop a tolerance. And that's what our lead drug has shown in a highly statistically significant phase 2 study run by arguably the godfather of social anxiety disorder out of Columbia, Dr. Michael Leibowitz. Dr. Leibowitz created the Leibowitz social anxiety scale that the FDA has used for really the only 3 drugs that have been approved for this, and that they are all antidepressants. So the time has come to have drugs that work rapidly and that can work much safer without the kinds of downstream risks that we've seen develop over decades with, in particular, benzodiazepines for anxiety.
So how does reimbursement treat this space? Is it very supportive, or is it very helpful, or is it still to come?
It's very helpful. I mean, most of the precedents have been set in, you don't see many of these drugs on TV anymore, although you do see them on TV occasionally. When you're watching a ball game, the first 10 seconds of an advertisement is great. And the next 50, you really want the volume to be turned down. So even those kinds of drugs are reimbursable. The problem is there just aren't that many options. And so doctors have to turn to what really is available to complement any kind of psychotherapy. And as long as they're monitored and as long as there's close interaction with the doctor, many of them, they can be effective. But the current universe, the current standard of care predominantly is generic at this point. And so a managed care decision associated with the drug that can provide a benefit without a debilitating side effect or a high risk of hospitalization or death because of a safety concern stands a real good chance, especially if the price is at a point that's reasonable on a monthly basis for the condition. If you're putting somebody back to work, you're keeping them out of the hospital, they're taking their children to soccer practice, they're able to have meetings with their colleagues or go on dates. Those are game-changing, life-changing outcomes that typically have very few levels of resistance, if any, from a payer. You never really know until you're done, and then you submit it, but we think we've got reasonable price targets in mind and the ability to change lives in a very productive way. I mean, just imagine if you even 100,000 people, let alone 1 million to 10 to 30 to 50 to globally 100 million people or more are all of a sudden innovative, creative, running companies, running families. It's remarkable what can be done if we can put people back to the ideal version of themselves and not be walking around and suffering under a cloud of anxiety or depression. Depression is the same as anxiety. There's really been nothing new for decades. The current drugs all focus on specific neurotransmitters in a specific way. They take quite a long time to work. If you were to go to a psychiatrist and you decided you needed to start taking a current antidepressant, well, your first one, you'd have about a 1 in 3 chance of that working. And the data will show you also that you're not going to know whether you're that lucky 1 out of 3 for at least 6 weeks and sometimes longer than that. And all along the way, you've got quite a few side effects you've got to wrestle with. Insomnia, sexual dysfunction, sometimes weight gain. So it's unfortunately a rinse and repeat process with drugs that take a long time to show you whether they're going to deliver a therapeutic benefit. And then if they don't, you got to start all over again. So we need to know faster. Patients need to know, doctors need to know much faster than weeks. We need to know now, within a week at most, let alone ideally shorter than that, whether something has an opportunity to make a difference in somebody's life and whether or not there are risks associated with that. So we focus on each of our 3 drug candidates. We have one for depression as well, we call PH10. They fit very specific criteria for us to have advanced them to these points. They've got to have a fundamentally different way of working. Nothing in the past can be like them. They have to have the ability to work quickly compared to the current standard of care. They have to not bring on safety risks that cause them to be more worrisome than the underlying condition they're trying to treat. And they have to be applicable in multiple different markets. So not just one particular type of anxiety disorder or depression disorder, but many. And that's the model we've been executing, even though our first candidates focuses on social anxiety disorder. Its unique characteristics allow us to pivot in multiple different directions, ultimately postpartum anxiety, preoperative anxiety. Currently, doctors or surgeons have to give an IV of Ativan about an hour beforehand. And so that's a drug that's involved systemically. All these benzodiazepines have to go throughout your whole body, and they're absorbed in parts of the brain where you want them to be and other parts where you don't want them to be. Well, our first two drugs are not systemic. They just have a unique, what we call mechanism of action, or MOA, which allows them to rapidly move from the nasal passage right to the part of the brain associated with fear and anxiety, and on the other hand, generating antidepressant effects. So those criteria are key in any business decision that we make about advancing a product candidate. And so far, each of the 3 we've got fits.
Great. Well, during the pandemic, we saw the rise of telemedicine. Of course, it's been around for a while, but it really accelerated it forward. Do you see telemedicine paired with the therapeutic as being the best solution? If so, how would that work?
I don't know if it's the best solution. I think it's definitely a helpful solution, especially if people are concern for their physical health and safety about going to see a doctor or going out in the world. I think it was a little more pronounced in the earlier months of the pandemic. But I hear mixed. I often will interact with, the best resource really is doctors and patients, people on the front line dealing with these mental illnesses day to day. And a lot of psychiatrists will say, sure, that's increased the opportunity to interact with patients and to help discuss some of these things. But there are others who will say the opposite, that they really don't feel they get as much as they might in-person session in terms of the talk therapy side of it. And so I think it's a mixed bag. I think ultimately it will help with efficiency in some clinical trial settings, for example. If you really don't have to go to the clinic in order to get that final follow-up visit in terms of your safety, for example, that could be achieved. That's something we're looking into for our next phase 3 study. But in other ways, telemedicine really won't play a role. So I think it's always better to provide as many opportunities to access help as possible. And the onset and advent expansion of telemedicine is terrific. I know from a doctor's perspective, not a mental health perspective, there are some things they can do. They can look at a rash and they can do some things that objectively help them to assess a scenario. And there's other things they just can't. They need to touch and assess the patient directly. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, good. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here today, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Well, we're in unprecedented times here today, and I think a lot of people need help. I'm not so sure everybody knows how to get that. I just want to certainly mention, if you've got trouble, if you feel overwhelmed, if you feel that you might have an anxiety disorder, and remember, a little bit of anxiety is good. We all have it. We all need it. You need to know when to dodge a car that might be aiming at you in a crosswalk, or avoid a dog that's baring his teeth. But if it's persistent, if it's ongoing, and especially if it interferes with your functioning day to day, whether it's depression or anxiety, that's where you need to seek help from a mental health professional. And our website, we've got a page that's called Finding Help. Hope, we really think hope is on the horizon, and it's available in multiple different directions. So I would encourage people to go to our website and access that Finding Help page for some support. The need is great. The opportunity we have to make a difference for patients and investors is game changing. And I encourage you to follow what we're doing, and we'll certainly do our best to keep investors and patients informed of our progress.
Great. Well, how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Again, our website, www.VistaGen.com, VISTAGEN.com. We have a contact page on there, and that's the best way for questions and comments to come into the company, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So we have videos on the website as to how we believe our drugs work in anxiety and depression. We've got our corporate presentation available on the website, as well as peer-reviewed published data. Science and medicine has to just drive everything that we do here, and peer-reviewed publications covering our data are also on the website. So good resource.
Well, we'll put those in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Great, Hall. Thank you very much, and everybody stay well.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Halti Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for the basis of investment decisions.